Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
שיכור מנוש.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
Pitutka niewiód.
Hello everyone. Wanted to do an update on the Food Lies film. We're shooting at Low Carb USA in San Diego in a couple weeks with Ivor and a couple other doctors, including the preeminent research in this field, along with Dr. Steve Phinney, Dr. Jeff Volek, whose studies are actually mentioned a few times in this episode. Really excited about this shoot and our next one at a conference in Ohio next month. Also really excited that we're 34% funded on Indiegogo. There's been a huge surge recently, so I want to thank everyone who's been contributing. I want to say the film is happening no matter what. I'll pay for it myself if I have to, so please support it. There's a link in the show notes. This is really important to me. I'm not some rich guy like Pete Evans who made the magic pill. I'm a guy living on some money I saved up so that I could take some time off to make this film. Just trying to scrape by. My friends think I'm crazy. So yeah, tell a friend if you can't contribute yourself or already have. Thank you so much. Now on to this episode. Ivor Cummins is a sharp Irish gent. He's a chemical engineer by trade, and his specialty is leading teams in complex problem-solving scenarios. This background helped him to really dive deep into cholesterol while also being unencumbered by the outdated mainstream views on the substance. He's gone over 3,000 studies on cholesterol and made some amazing realizations. He now travels around the world speaking on this to help doctors and laypeople understand the new data and updated science. I did link to some of the graphs he will mention. They're really compelling. The link is in the show notes. So quit your yammering and get to the guest. Okay, I will. Let's just get this going. We have Ivor Cummins here calling from Ireland, I assume.
Yeah, great to be here, Brian. How you doing?
I'm great. How about you? You've been traveling around. I know you were in Austin for KetoCon.
Oh yeah, KetoCon was a blast, and I just come straight from Zurich, where there was a Credit or Swiss Re, the world's largest reinsurer, did a Food for Thought conference with both sides, low carb and epidemiologists, and all the different players debating. So that was quite fun too.
Oh wow, I didn't know about that one. That's cool. I want to start out by saying thanks for doing all this research. There's doctors and professors and scientists doing all this research, but you've come at it from a different angle, from an engineering angle, and gotten really deep into it and made some awesome YouTube videos. There's a specific, the cholesterol conundrum, hour 47 minutes deep dive that I finally finished lately. It's amazing. But so yeah, just thank you for getting in the weeds.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, no, sure, I enjoy it. I became obsessed back around 2012, and once I got the bug, I couldn't stop. So I just kept going.
Well, it's very helpful to everyone. So yeah, so people have such a weird view of cholesterol, backwards view, just sort of misinformed. Partly it's the government's fault for giving us the wrong message for the past, 50 years. So most people think cholesterol as if you eat it, it's going to go straight to your arteries. You eat an egg and you get clogged arteries. You eat meat, you get clogged arteries. They think of it as the total cholesterol score. Like you go to the doctor, you get it, and that's all that matters. And maybe they know, oh, HDL is good, LDL is bad. That's, to me, from all the people I've talked to, common folk, that's all they know. So what's going on?
Right. Well, that's actually true. And particularly in Ireland, maybe slightly less so in America, they still just look at a high LDL bad cholesterol and presume that drugs are needed. But if you start with the total cholesterol, yeah, decades ago, they thought the total cholesterol, it correlated a little with poor outcomes for heart disease. So they thought, wow, the cholesterol is in the plaque in the arteries. And look, it correlates. If you're very high, you tend to get more heart attacks, it seems. And then they did some other epidemiological work, and they came to the conclusion that this was the magic number. And they were wrong, and it's accepted now that total cholesterol is a nearly worthless measurement. So the world did move on from that many years ago.
I think the doctors did. I think the normal public still needs to catch up. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, true. I mean, it is true that total cholesterol to this day shockingly, is still being viewed if it's above 200 milligrams as being a problem. And to be honest, even the authorities and the people who set guidelines have moved way beyond that. And they know now that total cholesterol is completely misleading. So that was okay. But then they had the bad cholesterol LDL and the good, supposedly HDL. And these are lipoproteins. So they're big molecules that contain cholesterol inside them. So the LDL one is supposedly bad and the HDL one is good. But what people probably need to know is that the top cholesterol experts in the world now say unless the LDL is over 200 milligrams in US units, it really doesn't have it's a terrible marker for disease, completely ambiguous. And the HDL actually is a good marker because when it's low, it does indicate that you probably have a significant issue. But the LDL, yeah, above 200, and even then it's questionable. One of the US's top cholesterol experts back in 98, produced a paper where he said unless the LDL bad cholesterol is above 300, which is huge, it really has no independent ability to predict heart attacks. So I guess people need to know that the top experts now have moved on from LDL. And in fact, many years ago, it was taken out of the risk calculators for heart attacks. You know, the risk calculators they use for whether or not. Yeah, you should get medical.
ASCVD score or stuff like that.
Yeah, and there's the Framingham Classic Risk Calculator and the Q Risk Score. So all of those measurements of future risk, LDL is gone from them. They actually use HDL and total and ratios. So if people got nothing else but realized that cholesterol measurements are most useful when you get the ratios between the different measurements, like triglyceride and HDL ratio or total cholesterol to HDL ratio, when you divide them into each other, they tell you some useful things. And that's really what's in the risk calculators are the ratios. But unfortunately, like you say, Brian, people don't realize that LDL has kind of fallen off the map because they use LDL levels to measure how you're responding to drugs, because that's the simple measurement that goes lower when the drug works. And it just makes business sense to keep a simple LDL bad cholesterol and keep things simple but misleading and wrong for everyone out there. And they've succeeded because many people, as you say, still believe in it.
Well, yeah. And I mean, they're still trying to make money, and that's how it works.
Yeah, that's a lot of it. Now, a lot of it is that they really believed in the bad cholesterol, and many still do. A lot of the researchers actually believe in it because it's beguiling. The LDL does correlate with future problems to an extent. And when you use drugs to lower the LDL, one of their effects is to lower the LDL, but they have many other effects in the body. And those trials with those drugs show some benefits, not really in mortality so much, but in lowering of heart attacks. So it's very tempting to say it was the magic bad LDL that we lowered with those drugs that really helped. But it's much more complicated than that. So LDL is a weak measure. Probably what people need to know as well is why are the ratios good? Because I did say that the ratios are actually quite useful. And the reason is they're not really telling you about cholesterol. The ratios reflect whether or not you're insulin resistant or insulin sensitive. So they actually indirectly tell you about a much more important cause of disease and death in an indirect way. And that's why they're actually quite good there.
Yeah, I was going to say that your insulin resistance or your blood glucose, stuff like that, is way better at determining disease than LDL.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at glucose and insulin together in various measurement types, or particularly your glucose and insulin levels after you eat a meal, that's called postprandial, that'll tell you a lot more about your physiological health than cholesterol values. And ironically, as I just said, the ratios of cholesterol give you a window into that world, and that's why they're actually useful. It's not really the cholesterol aspect of them at all, which is really confusing, as you can imagine, for people who don't understand the biochemistry, basically.
It's really complicated. That's part of the problem, is there's so much to this.
Yeah, there is. And I suppose beyond the traditional cholesterol measurements people are probably familiar with, LDL, HDL, and total, and the triglycerides, kind of a measure of fats in your blood. Beyond those, there's new advanced cholesterol measurements because the cholesterol business boomed for decades. And as LDL, it was discovered, was not actually a great predictor at all. In fact, it's quite embarrassing looking back on it. Technology was invested in and advanced to look at the quality of the LDL particles, not just the cholesterol in them. So we've got the new LDL particle count, the number of your LDL particles, and we've got the particle size of LDL. And those measurements are much better predictors than the old cholesterol ones. But again, like the ratios, the reason is because they quite faithfully reflect your level of insulin dysfunction. So yet again, we've got new, better cholesterol measures that are mostly just better at reflecting insulin dynamics and other issues with inflammation in the body.
Yeah, the take-home message here is insulin is the most important thing and that we should worry about that and not get so obsessed with different LDL scores.
Yeah, and that's not to say that insulin's the only thing. It's not. And people often accuse myself or Dr. Gerber or many other people in this research movement of saying it's all insulin, and it's not. In fairness, it is multifactorial: heart disease, Alzheimer's, many of the cancers, modern chronic diseases. They are multi-factor, but there's a few big important factors. And in engineering, I know you're an engineer yourself, so you'll remember the Pareto principle. You've got to spend your time on the 20% of the factors or things that cause around 80% of the issues or problems. You can't cover everything. And in the Pareto principle, focusing on the top drivers, yes, you're going to end up with insulin and, leptin, adiponectin, and other measures of systemic health, and much more important than cholesterol. And that's the way it is.
Yeah. So what is cholesterol specifically? Why don't you go into that for a second?
Okay, so cholesterol is basically a fat-like molecule, and it's fundamental for life. So no cholesterol, no life is a phrase I've heard before. And it's true. So all the animal life on the planet is kind of circulates around the cholesterol molecule. It works in all of our 30 trillion cells. All the membranes have cholesterol. It's used to repair cellular damage. It's used to make new cells. It's used to make your hormones. A type of cholesterol is used to create vitamin D with the sunlight in your skin. So our whole physiology, it's probably the most important molecule for health that exists, which is kind of ironic that they blamed it. Yeah. So funny. Yeah, so that's cholesterol. I think your brain is around 4% of your body weight, but it has 25% of your body's cholesterol. So your brain's absolutely full of fats and cholesterol. So it's a crucial, important molecule. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the cholesterol is carried in lipoproteins like LDL and HDL. So it kind of got caught in the scene of the crime that problems in your body where you have health issues, often your lipoprotein ratios and numbers and size get affected by the problems you have in your health. And therefore, cholesterol kind of gets smeared with, the real issues. And that's kind of what we talked about a few minutes ago. So a crucial molecule, absolutely required for health, that's been kind of maligned and got caught up in stuff that's not really its business.
So maybe you could talk about how that got started, back to Ancel Keys and stuff like that. What's the big overview of that? Yeah. Why did we think it's bad in the first place?
Yeah, well, really to give a potted history. So at the turn of the century, there was a guy, I think he was Russian, and he knew, and a lot of people did know, that there was cholesterol associated with the atherosclerotic plaques, the boils or pimples in your arteries that rupture and cause heart attacks. They're called atheroma. And they knew that cholesterol was kind of in those atheroma, and you could get fatty streaks with cholesterol in the artery wall. And they knew cholesterol had something to do with this process. So that was fine. But then this guy, I think he was Russian, he fed massive amounts of animal world cholesterol to rabbits. And he created a form of atherosclerosis. Now, it wasn't the same as the human one, but it looked similar. And he said, hey, presto, okay, we know that cholesterol is in the atheroma, and now I've stuffed rabbits with cholesterol, and they've developed problems that look the same. So now the proof is building a little. In fairness, he himself acknowledged that rabbits should not be eating cholesterol. It's not part of their diet.
Definitely
And
not.
yeah, and I think he also acknowledged that the atheroma that were created were different structurally than human ones. So he was kind of honest and said, well, look, guys, this is interesting, but he didn't try to really sell it. But the world kind of jumped on it a bit. And then when you go forward decades later and other work that was done, they were on the wrong trail of cholesterol for many years. And when it really blew up was in the 50s with Ansel Keys, like you mentioned. And he was I think he was a botanist or something and a researcher. He wasn't a physiological expert, but he developed the K rations for the World War, and he got a lot of influence because they worked out pretty well. And he began to get obsessed with heart disease because in the 50s, heart disease was exploding. Now, of course, it was the absolute explosion 20 years earlier in cigarette smoking, and very likely the vegetable oils and processed industrial oils and sugar that was all ramping up in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and creating a perfect storm for heart disease. But no one was looking at any of those things. They still were thinking cholesterol. So Ansel began to work on it, and he actually fed cholesterol to humans in a study. And he actually decided, quite rightly, that cholesterol is not relevant in the diet. So Ansel Keys himself, back in the 50s, realized that the cholesterol you eat, if you eat less, you'll make more from your liver. Most cholesterol in your body is made from your liver, maybe 80% plus. And if you eat less, your liver will make more because it's crucial. And if you eat more, your liver gets a break and makes less. And it's all a beautifully balanced system. So Ansel realized by feeding cholesterol to humans that it didn't really change the blood cholesterol. So he dumped it. Now, the really interesting thing for people is that only last year was it removed in the US as a nutrient of concern, cholesterol. So the other countries in the civilized world decades ago dropped cholesterol from the nutrients of concern list because they also knew this. But the US was so married to cholesterol, it still kept it in dietary guidelines up to last year. So
But people don't know that it's been dropped. I talk to people all the time and they have no clue. They're like, oh, wait, but cholesterol is terrible for you, right? No one has any idea.
Exactly. So they made a huge hue and cry in the 70s and 80s as the madness gripped them about all these things. And as they fall off the map, like total and LDL, and dietary cholesterol, as they all fall off the map because they're misleading and a bit ridiculous, they don't really shout about it. And you can imagine why.
Yeah.
No one's going to be thanked for shouting that from the rooftops because you're just shouting we were wrong on a massive scale. And no one's going to do that politically. So you're right. People don't really get to hear. So Ansel Keys anyway dumped it, quite rightly, in the 50s, but he became fixated that the diet heart hypothesis in his mind, what he called it, was that the dietary fat raises your serum or blood cholesterol, and the raised cholesterol causes heart disease. So he had no proof, but he decided that made sense to him. And he did some very simple, weak studies where he looked at the countries in the world, the amount of fat they ate, and saturated fat particularly, and the amount of heart disease. And he suggested that the more fat, the more heart disease. Now, this was a famous deception, the 6-country study, he called it, because there were 22 countries that if you looked at them all, it was just a scatter plot. There was no real relationship. But he picked 6 that made a beautiful apparent relationship between fat and heart disease. And the 6-country study got ridiculed by really smart people. I think Jeroboam, or I'm not sure the name, was one of them. And many researchers said this is a crock. But Ansel had a lot of support and he was a very dynamic individual. And he actually fought them publicly and kind of won out to get to do his 7-country study, which looked like a real human experiment done on humans. But it wasn't. It was just another correlation study with cherry-picked countries. And he should have, and probably did, know the way the result was going to come out, which is to support his theory of fat and heart disease.
And then, we had someone else talk about this already, but basically he went against Yudkin, who had the opposite idea that sugar and refined carbs were the problem. And Ansel Keys just won out. And then our dietary guidelines kind of were based on Keys's ideas instead.
Essentially, yeah, there was a public fight. Keyes was a very aggressive, very outspoken and scathing, powerful personality. And as we know in politics and business, that often overcomes any amount of data. Whereas Yudkin was a gentleman professor, quiet, reserved, and basically Keyes just blew all over him on the public stage, and Yudkin kind of had to retreat in disarray. So yeah, Keyes won the political battle as if it was a data battle, but it never was. It was a political battle, and Keyes won. And that set in motion then the dietary guidelines based on the 7-country study and all of this crock. They just went ahead, and Senator McGovern, although there were many academics, said, how can we go ahead and do a huge human experiment without proof or data? It's unprecedented. And Senator McGovern effectively, words to this effect, said, we don't have the time or luxury like you researcher guys to wait till all the proof's in. We got to take action. And they did.
Yeah. And they thought, yeah, it's insane. And I think there was some other quote, which was something like, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, we're lowering saturated fat. They were so sure of this bad hypothesis that they thought, oh, well, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, and there's other quotes, some other brilliant people at the time. One of them said, again, it's not verbatim, something like, I've never heard an idea so ludicrous that a modern epidemic of disease can be blamed on a ancestral food we've eaten all along. It's just absurd. And of course it was absurd. So
Wow.
if you look at an explosion of disease that's happened over a few decades, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to say, okay, what's gone up? Well, smoking, we know it's damaging, even though that was suppressed on the vascular system. And then, of course, vegetable oils had exploded from the turn of the century. And, of course, the sugars and refined carbohydrates. So you had all of these fantastic new kind of fake foods and toxins to go after. But no, they were commercial products, so no one was interested. So they went after the ancestral foods we evolved on. So when you look back in a way, it's not just wrong and has had disastrous consequences, but it's almost comical in a very tragic way. It's actually, to an engineer who works in problem solving, it's actually kind of a joke that they managed to pull this off.
Yeah, looking back, it seems like a joke. Or what if an alien species came down and saw what we were doing? They'd be like, is this real?
They'd be rolling around their spaceship. They just wouldn't believe it, because they would equally see Einstein and all of the other brilliant people of the last couple of centuries, and they'd say, wow, humans have made massive technological breakthroughs, and how did they do this? I mean, this is baby stuff.
Yeah, you don't have to have any technical background. Kind of like you said, you don't have to know biochemistry. You don't have to know anything. You can just think logically. You can ask a 10-year-old. They probably know how humans evolved and what they ate for millions and millions of years. And then you could say, do you think this is bad for them? Why would this be bad for them?
Yeah, and they'd ask quite rightly, well, if you're saying it's bad for them, it doesn't make any sense. So obviously you must have some compelling data that demonstrates it's bad. And of course the answer is no. We have epidemiological flim-flam and wishy-washy junk science. That's all we got, sorry. But we're going ahead anyway.
Well, also, we spent over $1 billion trying to prove this bad hypothesis.
Oh, the Women's Health Initiative was one of the big debacles. That one basically, with a low fat, low saturated fat and a few other more vegetables and all, and very large number of women, it came up pretty much a blank. After like 8 to 10 years, it came up and they admitted nothing happened. And of course, they did lower the LDL, I think, in that one. But what really changed, or what really they would have had to have been measuring and targeting as a metric, would be the ratios we talked about earlier, insulin. Mm-hmm. If they could do an intervention that lowered insulin and glucose and changed the ratios of the cholesterol, if they actually did something that did that, they would have got a result. But they were running around in circles after LDL and a wrong, incorrect hypothesis, so it failed. And there were a few other trials as well that failed spectacularly. I think it was the MR Fit was another one.
Mr. Fit, or they call it?
Mr. Fit, yeah. And LL, the lipid. Oh, they had another one where they actually picked men who were really high in cholesterol. So they stacked the deck hard. And they picked men who had super high cholesterol to give themselves the best chance of a result. And they gave them cholesterol, I think the drug, which stops you absorbing cholesterol in your gut. And it wasn't even a dietary trial, actually. It was more a drug trial. But in the end, they got basically a null result, even though they successfully lowered the cholesterol. So there was a litany of trials that they were confident they were correct. So they did all these trials with great excitement, simply to dot the I's, cross the T's, tick the box and say, yeah, we're correct. And the trials all failed. So of course, what you do then is you just say, whoa, guys, let's back up here. Sorry, it looks like we were fooled yet again by epidemiology. And it looks like it's really not true. Sorry. But of course, they didn't say that. And one trial was held back for 16 years. The results were held back from publication. Yeah, when Gary Taubes asked the author, why did it not get published? He actually said on the record, well, we really weren't happy with the way the results turned out, which is shocking. I mean, that is a lie of omission. By not publishing a negative result, that's nearly as bad as publishing a falsified positive result. It's quite shocking.
Yeah, and it's good. We're doing things to change that, like clinical trials dot something, right? Where no matter what, the results of the studies have to be shown.
Yeah, that's crucial. I know that alltrials.org or All Trials in capitals is one of the organizations, and there may be a couple of them, but that's the intention, that if you're going to do a trial, you have to put on the record what you're going to measure, how you're going to analyze it, and what your expected result is. And once you've done the trial, there'll be follow-up, and if you don't publish, you'll be pursued. And that's absolutely crucial, because there is a mountain of unpublished research that didn't suit. And even in some pharma arenas, you could do a few trials and one of them could statistically look out for you, or you could work out and you show a slight benefit, and a couple others do not. So you simply don't publish the ones that don't. And if you keep doing trials, you're going to hit on statistically lucky moments, especially when you're designing the trial carefully to kind of jack up your chance of a result. And this is a huge problem, Yeah, the drug trials, the companies trying to sell their pharmaceutical product, they do tons of them and just wait till they get something that hits, right? Yeah, well, to be honest, I guess if I was in that business, if I was allowed to do it, I'd probably do that, because you've got to make a profit, and you've got to do whatever you can within the law to maximize your business success. So if you're allowed not publish, I mean, what executive, why on earth would you? I mean, imagine saying, no, I'm going to publish this, even though it's going to mess up my business model and cause embarrassment and trouble to everyone in my business and all my colleagues. I think I'll publish it anyway because I'm a good Christian. I mean, it just doesn't happen in today's world. Let's be honest. And the people who become successful and influential in the layers of corporate business at the higher levels, let's face it, you've weeded out the real conscientious, super ethical religious types probably by then anyway.
Yeah, these guys are not messing around. And I was going to say this whole thing, and if you look at the past 50 years, is not some big conspiracy or anything like that. We got some bad information and people wanted to make money. Of course, businesses need to make money. And so the government said, hey, low fat is good. So people made low fat products, and now we have Snackwells and a million terrible low fat products. It's not like they were evil. They just went with the flow and they went with the money. So it's just a natural thing.
Yeah, it's free market capitalism. It works well and it self-regulates to a point. But if you get a really bad idea, once everyone's on board, like the food industry, it was a massive boon to be able to use dirt cheap vegetable oils and sugars and starches and grains. And the research community was actually telling them to use the cheapest ingredients with the biggest profit margin. I mean, what's not to like? And then, of course, pharma over the decades, I'm sure they're smart guys and they know what drives chronic disease. And it's mostly their buddies in the food industry. So everyone who has a major interest, it's not in their interest to reverse the mistake. It just doesn't suit anyone, except maybe the tax budgets of countries and the citizens. But anyone in business worth a damn benefits from the way things went. Not through a conspiracy, like you say, they didn't create it. The researchers were the ones who created it, really. But then everyone's interest became entwined with it. And that was it.
Yeah, and no one can give it up. No one can go back on and say everything they did was wrong. And it's just human instinct to not say that. And it's entrenched beliefs that it's just going to take a while for it to turn around.
Yeah, that's a huge force in itself. I mean, if you spend 30 years saying a message and you begin to hear noises that it's incorrect, the cognitive bias kicks in. It's nearly impossible to face it. So you will look for every scrap of data that says you were correct all along. and you will fight scraps of data that say you were wrong all along. And nearly all of them are the same, except for Professor Noakes and some other notable people. Most academics and researchers, they just can't face that they were largely wrong for decades.
Yeah. And I did talk to Professor Noakes, and he publicly ripped out the pages of his book where he said that high carb for athletes was good. So
in the Serial Killers movie, I think the first one, that was a big moment. But he's a tower of personal strength and kind of ethical robustness. I mean, he's very unusual. And I know that his wife, Marilyn, as well, he could not have done what he did and fought the smear campaign against him without the two of them as a unit and their legal team just locking in and saying this is the right thing to do. And that's the exception nowadays, if we're quite honest. People with that kind of bravery.
Yeah, it's awesome what he's doing. And I think that something like that happened in Sweden too. Some researchers in Sweden figured out this low carb stuff. And then there was a bit, Moab, don't you?
Yeah, I should remember her name. It escapes me. But yes, it was a lady doctor who came to this realization and began to do low carb for her diabetic patients and other patients with obesity. And she began to have great success. And I believe 2 individuals reported her to the government standards body, a bit like Gary Fetka in Australia or Noakes in South Africa. And she got reported. But in Sweden, luckily, they seem to have a pretty good system because the government departments didn't immediately jump on her. They said, we need an investigation. And they actually went and did a huge investigation involving thousands of academics over many years, and they published a report in the end. Now, they did not say, guys, she's completely correct, we need to go low carb. But what they said was there is no evidence that low carb is a problem or can't be an option that could be helpful for modern problems. So it was a huge validation of her. And Sweden is one of the leading low carb countries in the world, and also due to Andreas Einfeld, a diet doctor, obviously with the huge diet doctor site. But Sweden is leading.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Sweden is leading the way, and they're showing that it's very effective. Why don't we talk about some of these other studies that prove the low carb diet, how effective it is? I know I watched your cholesterol conundrum video. That's on YouTube. If anyone wants to really get into the weeds, definitely watch that.
Yeah, that was a big one, all right. And an hour and 45, but I think around 20 minutes plus was Q&A at the end. But that was really good too, the Q&A, because you got real questions from an audience of around 100 engineers, and they asked good questions. So I think it adds to the video to have that extra in there.
Yeah, well, I watched it all in basically one sitting. I was engaged, but then again, I'm insane and I'm obsessed with this stuff. So let me bring up some of the studies in there. Well, a lot of the studies by Volek, those were just, I wish we could show some graphs. Somehow I'll link to graphs of this. But these studies he did, it's almost impossible to deny them, that this low-fat diet does not work and how effective it is when you start reducing carbs. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, well, we actually picked a couple of representative ones for the book, myself and Dr. Gerber just released, and I can actually send pictures of them after because they're already done in the book format, kind of nice and colored. So, so Volek, a couple of them spring to mind. Volek got a whole bunch of kind of overweight metabolic syndrome people, and these are the people you want to look at because they're the ones with the risk, the people who have cholesterol ratios bad, they're overweight, they've got hypertension, blood pressure. So they took these most vulnerable people who had issues. And one study, they've split them in half, proper randomized trial, the ultimate experiment, and they gave half a healthy low-fat diet. Now, they didn't give them some junk and SnackWells. They gave them a proper low-fat diet, and they gave them, I think it was only 12% of saturated fat, let's say. And then they gave the other group a very low-carb ketogenic diet, which just means it's really low on carb with a lot of saturated fat. I think it had 36 grams, really high in saturated fat and general fat. And they ran them through a period of many weeks on this diet, and they saw a whole range of markers got better, relatively better, on the very low-carb ketogenic diet versus the healthy low-fat diet. So that was great. But also they got really interesting stuff. The people on the high saturated fat diet, their blood levels of saturated fat reduced a lot, much more than the low-fat diet guys. So Volek was able to make the point, not only is the low carb better for these people who are the most important people who have disease and who need it most, not only does it improve their metrics, but by eating more fat and less carb, you reduce your levels of blood fats. And blood fats are correlated to disease. Whatever about dietary fats, the fat in your blood is not a good thing. It indicates insulin resistance and problems processing sugar and fat. So he beautifully showed that their blood fats even got much lower by eating a very high saturated fat diet with low carb. So that was a really nice one. You can probably attach it. The other Volek one was really cool because they did a similar thing, the low carb ketogenic diet versus a healthy low fat diet. Not a sneaky one with lots of sugar, a healthy one. And in this case, they measured not just the usual stuff, but a whole range of very good exotic inflammatory markers. And I send the graph, but I think there's around 18 to 20 measurements. And the low carb, high fat keto diet, again in people who had some challenges, it lowered the insulin much more than the low fat glucose. It increased HDL, the low fat didn't. It lowered the particle counts that we talked about earlier, and the ratios improved greatly. A much greater lowering of the triglycerides, which is fantastic. But then a whole cluster of a dozen inflammatory markers, and the graph is quite striking. The low carb, high fat diet lowered a whole range of inflammatory markers, whereas the low fat diet was much weaker effect. So that for me just hammered home. Any engineer looking at that would say, wow, across a whole range of metrics that matter, the low carb ketogenic in people we should be most concerned about blew away the low fat. And it's a wow moment. But unfortunately, although it's published and available, the cognitive dissonance guys on the other side just don't want to know about it because it's very embarrassing.
Yeah, it's so compelling when you see these graphs, and there's so many of these studies too. I'm sure you've sifted through a bunch of them, and just to let people know who are just getting into all this, there is so much evidence, just that people don't want to hear it. It's not making it out into the world. That's why I'm making this movie. That's why I'm doing this podcast, is just to try to get people to look at this stuff and not just go through a HuffPost article that says, don't eat meat, you're killing the environment, which is a whole nother thing in itself that I talk about sometimes. And I mean, okay, let's do rapid fire. Let's do another one real quick. Helsinki policeman study.
Helsinki policemen's. Yeah, that one I dug out years ago, finding it while I was on the rabbit trail or going down the rabbit hole. And I probably have around 3,000 plus studies now, published science I've gone through over the 6 years. But Helsinki I liked because they followed these Helsinki policemen over around 20 years follow-up in total. But what was interesting was it was one of the few studies where they looked at the insulin after a meal. They gave them glucose to drink and they measured their insulin response afterwards. And that's quite a good measurement. And it's the basis for the Kraft test for people who are more familiar. But anyway, they measured it. And the interesting thing was after 20 years or so of follow-up, they said, yeah, the people who had higher insulin after a meal, absolutely, they had higher disease, and heart disease was what they were looking at. You know, it was a bit higher, but it was much relatively higher at 10 years. And when you go to 6 years after the start of the study, there was 9 times as many heart events in the high insulin people as the low. And for me, what I think it is, what makes it interesting is if you measure someone's bodily measurements and you follow them, you got to be careful following them for too long. Because the guys who are high insulin, who have disease at the start, and there's guys who have very low insulin who are healthy. Now, after 5 years, you can see a fair difference, a 9 times difference, which is enormous. I mean, compared to cholesterol or any other measurement. But as you keep following them without measuring them again, the guys who are low insulin at the start of the study are getting older and they're eating crap like everyone else. And they're becoming higher insulin guys. So you begin to dilute the signal between high insulin and low. And the team made up various reasons as to why, as the years went by, the signal or the effect seemed to get smaller. And they had a few reasons, but they never mentioned that they only measured them at the start. So the healthy guys are going to be steadily getting older, and many of them unhealthy, and then they're going to be exposed to the same disease as the guys who started high. But the key finding was at 6 years, which is a very fair follow-up, there was around 9 times more heart events for the high insulin guys, which is a massive multiplier, obviously.
Well, that's, 900%. And then the LDL, I think this showed that the LDL did not show that much of a difference. It showed the LDL didn't have as big as a factor.
Well, overwhelmingly, and I've gathered all the studies that have insulin and LDL together, the LDL is in the dunce's seat. Just forget about it. But Helsinki Policeman's was, from memory, it was a pretty pure insulin study. And I think they measured those things, but they did not really publish on them. And one of the reasons is often you'll see in papers that measure LDL, they won't actually summarize LDL's performance in the paper. Yet again, for the obvious reason. It's too embarrassing.
Yeah. I think this one was 1.2, the factor in LDL. So it's like a 9 factor compared to 1.2, which is 1.2 is not much at all.
Yeah, well, I think when I presented on the Helsinki Policeman's, I took LDL as a comparison, which it'll be around 1.2 to 1.5, and it's only a correlation. It's not even really causal. But yeah, so maybe I can't remember exactly, but I went through so many papers before Helsinki that I had long since realized that LDL was almost meaningless. So at that stage, I was after insulin, adiponectin, leptin, and all of the really important measures, or free fatty acids, and all the important stuff. I mean, anyone who researches this honestly and with talent very quickly can move on beyond LDL and just leave it behind. It's kind of wasting your time.
And quickly to go back a little bit, I don't know if we covered this exactly, but when you eat a low carb, high fat diet with a lot of saturated fat, your LDL does go up. I mean, some people think that's bad, but like we said, that's not bad. The HDL goes up, which is good. That's your good cholesterol goes up, and your triglycerides go down. So that's why it's confusing, is when this happened to me, I started eating this diet and I got my blood work, and my doctor was like, oh no, your LDL is so high. You need to lower this. And I looked at it and my HDL is amazing. My triglycerides are amazing. This doctor just doesn't know the new research, basically.
Yes, well, that's a great point. And the funny thing is, if you stick your numbers into the genuine modern risk calculator, it doesn't use LDL. So it will probably come out. So doctors like that are looking at LDL, not realizing that it's been dumped. They don't even realize it's gone because of this mass hypnosis. So if you put yours in with your high HDL, low trigs, you had a very low remnant cholesterol, and the risk calculators would take account of all of the true science pretty much, and they'd come back and say you're okay. But the individual doctors are still looking at a near meaningless marker. Now, the only caveat for that for people is if you change a diet, in Volek's experiments, for instance, the LDL after a period leveled off. And in Dr. David Unwin's work in the UK, amazing work with diabetics and obese people going low carb, on average, their LDL isn't going up much. But certainly there's a proportion of people who go very low carb or keto and their LDL does really jump. And I think what I'd say to those people, look, LDL isn't so silly that you just completely ignore it. If your LDL jumps up, you need to go in and just verify that it has not jumped up in a potentially problematic way. And I think that's being very fair. And Dr. Gerber, my co-author, is the same. If it jumps up, you want to look closer, look at your insulin, look at your inflammatory markers, look at your ratios, and properly verify that this high LDL that you've seen in your body is not indicating that something's not quite right for you. And people really need to go to cholesterolcode.com, because there Dave Feldman has done incredible work on self-testing and has made incredible breakthroughs in understanding the hyper-responders whose LDL jumps up really high. And he's given all these easy to follow explanations of why, and helps you decide if you're high LDL, if you double your LDL and it's super high, it helps you decide whether or not that's a problem.
Yeah, I just started talking to Dave recently. His stuff is great.
It's amazing that what he's discovering after billions of dollars and 50 years of research into cholesterol, he on his own, with almost no funding, is making genuine, completely new discoveries in lipoproteins and cholesterol. And they should have been made 40 years ago. It's stunning. Yeah.
And another shout out to engineers. He's an engineer.
Oh yeah, and he's a software engineer. So he's not even like bio. He's taking a systems view, and he's worked all of this out and tested himself and many others now using his systems networking knowledge of how systems work together synergistically. And he's actually worked this out through that method, and his results bear out the facts.
Yeah, it's great. And talking about LDL, you didn't really talk about particle size in detail. So how do people get clogged arteries? How do people actually get atherosclerosis? Like what causes it's inflammation in the arteries. And talk about that with the small, dense LDL particles.
Right. Now, there's a controversial one that's still a controversy. So I lay out both sides. So the primary driver of atherosclerosis is an insult to the arterial wall, the endothelium, or the thin multi-cell layer on the inside of your artery, which protects your artery from what's in your blood and anything else. So inflammation is really just a reaction to insult. So when you get inflammation as a result of insults, the inflammatory process can in turn cause damage. So it can be a cause, but it's kind of more a reaction to an insult. So we always got to think, what are the insults that drive the disease? Because they're the root causes you need to eliminate. Needless to say, cholesterol is not an insult to your artery. Right? That's absurd. That's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But high blood sugar is an insult through many mechanisms. High blood insulin is an insult through many mechanisms. High fats in the blood are problematic through many mechanisms. So now we see a whole series of things you want to reduce because they drive problems in your artery. And high blood pressure, it is argued, isn't just something that goes high when you've got other problems and it's kind of a proxy. High blood pressure, it is suggested, and with certain evidence, strains the arteries at certain junctions. And if you strain the artery inner wall, it has to repair itself and you get weak points and you get an ingress of problems. So high blood pressure is another insult. So we've kind of gone through all these insults. And now we come to your question. How is small LDL an insult? Or is it? And here's where we have the two schools of thought. One school of thought is the simplistic one, that the smaller LDLs, even though they're like maybe 20 micron instead of 24 micron, they're nearly the same size. They're only a tiny difference. It's suggested they're small and they get into your artery easier, okay? There's no real proof of that, but that's one thing that gets suggested. It's also suggested that they're smaller and misshapen and they don't get taken up by the liver out of circulation like they should do. They don't fit the receptors as well, so they stay in the blood longer. And this one has some data. Smaller particles can stay maybe 4 days instead of 2 in your blood, and that can leave them hanging around and prone to damage and make them oxidized and problematic. That's a fair accusation that small are causal. And there's a couple other ones around small, but they're probably the main ones. The other view is that small cholesterol particles are an indicator of insulin resistance. So yet again, we come back. There is no question in this world, but generally speaking, for bad diet eating people, when they become dysfunctional with high insulin and glucose, it turns their system and switches it over where their particles become smaller, or pattern B. There is no question around that. So this second view of the world might say, look, the small ones are not necessarily causal as much as they're a good reflection of real problems going on. High glucose, high insulin, high blood fats, insulin resistance, and all the real issues. And high blood pressure, is going to be a fact of life with hyperinsulin. I mean, it's almost, synonymous. So hopefully people, if they follow that, there's two schools of thought. Now, I believe there may be a bit of both, but I think that small dense LDL is probably more powerful as a proxy for genuine problems that are happening under the hood. Just generally, yeah. I think it's more powerful there. And then there's probably a bit of the oxidation and the floating around in the blood for too long. And I don't think there's really any at all of sneaking into your artery because the size is almost the same as the big ones. That's a bit long-winded, but that's how I would summarize it.
Cool. And to even go to higher levels, so is it your belief, it's kind of my belief that clogged arteries and heart disease, that's what atherosclerosis really is, plaques in the arteries, that is caused by eating refined grains and sugars and not eating saturated fat like we thought? Or even the combination. If you're eating a bunch of saturated fat and you're eating a bunch of refined grains and sugars, then you're going to have definitely a problem. But it's more the problem is the inflammatory aspect of this high blood glucose and stuff like that.
Yes, exactly. So certainly, I'm glad you mentioned the combination. I mean, a combination of refined carbohydrate and even healthy fats together is not a good mix at all. And to be honest, some of the polyunsaturates, there's evidence to say that if you're eating refined grains and modern Western diet, the saturated fat can become part of the problem. It's not fair to blame it though, because you did it with the refined carb, but the saturated fat becomes a really bad combo. And if you take the saturated fat out with that bad refined carb diet and you put in polys, you'll actually get a slight improvement in your situation. But again, it's not really the saturated fat's fault. It was the refined carb. So it can be very misleading. But essentially, yeah, at the high level, the refined carb, myself and Dr. Gerber would probably put it at the top of the list, along with vegetable oils, which are inflammatory. And the combination of both together is certainly probably a synergy that leads to many, many problems. And hyperinsulinemia, high blood glucose, diabetic phenomena, all of these things are knock-on effects of what you put in your mouth. Now, I will say there are lots of other causes. So if you are highly stressed and lacking in sleep, it has been proven that your insulin and your insulin resistance will rise, often quite dramatically. If you smoke cigarettes, your insulin and your insulin resistance will rise. If you have gut permeability from eating foods you're sensitive to, bacterial endotoxins can get through into your blood, cause an immune reaction, and your insulin and insulin resistance will rise. So insulin and insulin resistance are not just a causal problem, they are also a great gauge of whether there's something else wrong under the hood. But none of what I've said really included saturated fat outside of the scenario where you're eating it with refined carbohydrates or with too much vegetable oils and other things. There is one thing I'll probably have to mention. There may be exceptions to what I said, and the jury is a little in, a little out, that ApoE4 genetic types that are 17% of the population, and my own supporter, David Bobbitt of Irish Heart Disease Awareness, is one of those. So am I actually, and so is my wife. One of my kids, we found out, is double E4, which is less than 1%, and huge risk for disease. But long story short, ApoE4 who have destroyed their metabolism and become diabetic with sugars, refined carbs, and vegetable oils, once they have a problem, it's quite possible, and there's some evidence, they may have a sensitivity to excessive saturated fats and animal fats and proteins. So it's something for thoroughness. We always say, if you are an ApoE4 and you can get a 23andMe genetic test, it's only around $100. If you are that person and you may experience higher insulin or glucose with excessive protein and certain things, and you really owe it to yourself to just check that there's nothing funny going on there. But it's the exception that proves the rule, really, if it's true.
And is it mostly for people who are already metabolically damaged? Because if you're not metabolically damaged, you actually have a less risk
I would
of the expression of the ApoE4 gene?
Yes, and one of the most beautiful papers that I came across a year or two ago was they looked at ApoE4 versus the other types, and they had a higher risk for heart disease, but not much higher on average. But then they separated them out by ones who had metabolic syndrome and ones who did not. And believe it or not, for ApoE4 who had metabolic syndrome, which is insulin resistance syndrome, which is essentially type 2 diabetes, right, to an extent, for those guys, they had a 4, 5 plus X higher risk for heart disease. The ApoE4s with insulin resistance had a much higher risk. And the ones without insulin resistance, right, who are metabolically healthy, had a 3 or 4 or 5X lower risk than the other types. Yeah. So that will just illustrate to you how crucial it is for ApoE4 as to whether or not you develop insulin resistance. That's the biggest thing in the world that ApoE4 needs to avoid. And ApoE4 are the ancestral earliest human genotype, and because they're the oldest genotype, they've less adapted to the modern crap foods. They're less adapted to modern toxins, and if they get an ancestral diet, they'll probably be better, faster, than other people. But if they get the modern diet, they can go down like a stone. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, this This is how I kind of got into this 4 years ago. Is my parents had health problems, and yeah, my mom is in stage 4 of Alzheimer's.
Sorry
And
to hear that.
Yeah, I believe we had the wrong information about what to eat. And she wasn't an actual type 2 diabetic officially, but I think her genes definitely got expressed by the diet.
And
yeah, so basically.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, I was just thinking Alzheimer's now, of course, is popping up everywhere. It's being called type 3 diabetes. And for ApoE4, the risk for Alzheimer's, particularly in women, is much higher risk multiplier for ApoE4 for Alzheimer's than it is for heart disease. So Alzheimer's is the really big risk for ApoE4. And that's where my supporter, David Bobbitt, both his parents got Alzheimer's. But for people listening, there's more and more evidence it's a form of insulin resistance in the brain and starvation of the brain components of glucose because of the insulin resistance. So it's like insulin resistance from modern diet manifesting itself in a different way to classic diabetes. And yeah, so we can't say this for sure, but your best chance of not expressing the ApoE4 gene and getting Alzheimer's or heart disease is to eat the ancestral diet without the modern processed grains and sugar. Absolutely, and get healthy sun exposure and basically reproduce the environment insofar as you can that you evolved in, and avoid modern toxins and modern toxic foods. That's the way I'm an E4, so obviously that's the way I'm going. And my son is double E4, I mentioned. So he's got something crazy like a 15 or 20 times risk of Alzheimer's. If you're double E4, he has both gene strands have the E4. And he's been I suspected he was because he was asthmatic. He's very sensitive to refined carbohydrate and grains. His nose blocks up, his lungs wheeze. And he had many other issues growing up that when I learned this stuff, we got him tested because myself and the wife both said, I bet he's double E4. And hey, presto, we got the result there a couple of weeks ago.
Wow. So I'm sure you guys are keeping him on a good diet.
He eats olives. Watching television, he'll eat a pot of olives. He'll eat cheeses. He'll eat fish from cans. He'll eat all the stuff the modern kids generally don't. He used to, when he was very young, he used to eat butter from the dish, scoop it with his fingers, and we said, wow, that's hilarious. We didn't understand anything back then, of course. And he used to eat butter from the dish. And again, you can probably guess the instinct that's occurring. He's seeking out the good. It's crazy.
Animals they've done studies on animals, and they have these instincts to go for the different. Well, I think it was in Weston A. Price's book. They talked about cows or chickens, or someone went for they had 2 types of butter that were indistinguishable. Yet the chickens went for the highly nutrient dense grass fed butter instead of, say, the one that was raised on bad grasses or something.
Yeah, because the vitamin K2 and the magic nutrient X that Price was looking for. It's
Activator X.
Yeah, and it's in the spring lush grasses are what makes the butter yellow and highly nutritious. Yeah, I did. And then you've got the cattle. You could say dumb cattle, right? Animals, but they lick the salt licks. I mean, no one taught that in cattle school. They lick the salt licks. The hunter animals and humans, ancestral humans, would go for organ meats. They'd prize the liver and kidneys, and they'd also crack open, get brains. So instinct is very powerful through evolution. Unfortunately, though, there's a kicker to that. We also have an instinct to take advantage of sweet foods whenever they're available, because traditionally in summer and autumn, they meant survival through the winter. And sweet foods are almost never toxic or will poison you. So we're driven to eat the sweet foods. And now, of course, they're brought in by airplanes and modern, all year round. It's a tragedy.
Yeah. So kind of closing remarks here. Basically, there's many factors to all the chronic disease we have. But when it comes down to it, insulin resistance and poor blood sugar control and all that stuff seems to be at the center of it. So the simplest way to be healthy is to not raise your blood sugar, not eat foods that are highly refined sugars and grains, and just eat how we used to eat, right? Ancestrally. And that's when we didn't have much sugar. Our ancestors probably ate around a teaspoon and a half of sugar per day, and then now we eat 20 to 40.
Yeah, that was a nominal estimate of a daily amount of sugar through the bitter fruits and some other sources, but really low. And now it's, I believe, 40 is the figure for American teenagers or Australian teenagers, and on average maybe 25. It's crazy. So if you take sugars, man-made refined seed oils, vegetable oils, and processed foods, which are stuffed with both, they're really the modern century of disease, the new foods. The old ones were there since time immemorial with, like you say, vanishingly low rates of diabetes or cardiac disease. So yeah, and maybe one, if we're wrapping up shortly, I'm currently trying to get the message out around the world that, all these blood measures, they're not overly amazing in predicting your heart disease and death, especially in the United States. For around $100, there's a 5-minute calcium scan to give a CAC score. And that's a no-brainer to an engineer for a middle-aged person, middle risk, who wants to know, well, do I have disease or not? Not just heart disease, but general disease. What's my level? And this scan shows the calcium growing in your arteries over the years if you have the problems we talked about. The higher the score, the more disease. But the beauty is you can find out your current level and then do a lot of the stuff we said and stop that calcium increasing in the coming years. And then your risk goes from maybe 10 or 20 times a low scoring person and goes right back down to as if you never had a score. Once you intervene and stop the root causes, the score will stop rising or slow down and your risk plummets. So this is the message of hope. If you follow the rules, you can even be highly diseased right now, and you can almost completely nullify the risk by doing the right things. And that's crucial.
Yeah, it's never too late to change your diet, and you can reverse type 2 diabetes. Not many people know that. It's not some chronic disease that people live with, like you're led to believe, and people just manage the symptoms with insulin and you just get sicker and sicker. People are reversing it just by changing their diet, and you can reverse some of the damage and at least hold it off. And yeah, I did want to bring that up. Sorry. The CAC, the coronary artery calcium scan. So look it up if you're listening, and it's a great marker.
Yeah, and it's truly a marker of disease, looking at the disease process itself rather than indirectly by proxy looking at your bloods and taking a guess. So that's probably the power. But if people Google Widowmaker CAC, those two words, they'll get straight to a viewing of a $2 million movie that my supporter actually funded, zero profit. Pure philanthropy. It's got Gillian Anderson and it's got the top cardiologists in the world, and it's very exciting drama about stents and about calcification and the whole history it's kind of a bit like the fat history with Keys. It's kind of been a bit disgraceful. So it's a very exciting, eye-opening movie, and it's available.
Didn't the Mayo Clinic figure out that you could do this test and then the administration buried it a little bit?
Yeah, that's like we were talking earlier about business rules. Yeah, what happened was and it's in the movie along with a lot of other amazing facts, but a team of researchers in the Mayo Clinic, and they're top-notch guys, in fairness, it's a great clinic. The researchers learned about this new calcium scan. They realized that it had an incredible correlation with actual future events. So if you're a low score versus a high score, you could be 20 times more likely to have a heart attack with a high score. So it blows away every other measure. So they figured, well, we have all these people going in for invasive cath lab where we put catheters into them and, dyes. And these are invasive, expensive procedures. What if we scanned all the potential people first with this quick 5-minute scan, and the people who are zero, we don't need to bring them in for an expensive invasive operation? So they did the study and they found out that they could stop half of their current clients coming in for an operation. And they were really excited, and they went to management. And of course, management, I've been in management, they very quickly realized, well, a third of our revenue comes from the cath lab. And if we have the number of people coming in, we will lose half of our main source of revenue. Thank you very much. So the project was closed down. Of
course. It's crazy, but it's business, and I guess it happens. Well, I should tell everyone you have a book you wrote with Dr. Gerber, Eat Rich, Live Long. So I suggest everyone go and get it. I just looked it up on Amazon. It almost is a joke how many good reviews there are. I've never seen such a 5-star heavy review.
Yeah, Jeff actually was a bit embarrassed even a month or two ago because it's very unusual. But okay, to be honest, there's a lot of people going on who love it, and it's as simple as that. There's probably people, though I only recognize a handful of names, but there are people who are maybe following already. But the truth is, we were extremely happy. We got a professional editor funded by the Irish Heart Disease Awareness, who I work for now, and David Bobbitt. very expensive in New York. And Victory Bell Publishers had 2 editors on it, and they did a further round of tuning to make it approachable to ordinary people, and also leaving enough depth later in the book for the science nerds. So we achieved, I think, just this great balance. And we had a professional chef, Ryan Turner, who put in 50 high color, glossy photos and recipes, keto and low carb. And there's 300 and something scientific references. So it's kind of a Bible, and we really spend a lot of time getting it just so. And I think luckily it's reflected in the reviews, thankfully.
That's awesome. Well, it's called Eat Rich, Live Long, and it's on my list. I'm backed up with books right now, but it's in the queue.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. No, I know what it's like for sure. And it's in Costco in the US, which is nice, and Barnes & Noble. But like you say, Amazon and Kindle are how a lot of people get these things, I guess.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ivor. I guess I'll see you in a month in San Diego at the Low Carb USA.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And you're going to be shooting for Food Lies for the new movie.
Yes, we are. That's going to be great. We're going to try to get Dr. Gerber as well, and we'll maybe get some footage of the conference. And yeah, we're on Indiegogo right now. I talk about it before and after each episode, but yeah, we're trying to raise money right now. We're chugging along. It's hard.
Yeah.
But
excellent. No, I didn't. I wasn't even sure about the method. So I know I'll certainly send that on and proliferate it for sure. You know, it sounds like it's going to be a great one. I've seen your trailer with all the top guys. And yeah, we need this to get the message out to the ordinary people beyond the low carb community, as you're intending, to get beyond the kind of the nerds and the people who already know.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
Yeah, we're trying to get everyone involved. I mean, I'm talking to my aunt, who's a little bit older. I just want to get every type of person in on this. Just get it so that a younger kid could figure it out, and someone older. Just get this information out there to as many people as possible, and being able to sit down for 90 minutes and get an entire picture of it, instead of trying to go to 3 different books and 2 different lectures and 10 different research papers. Like, no one's going to do that. And there's been some pretty decent movies so far, but even Magic Pill, I think, is a little, people had some problems with it. They thought they were making too big of claims, and they only went on the keto diet. And, I'm trying to make a more balanced film and just not make any crazy claims and just stick with the science. And a lot of the stuff is personalized to the individual, so we can't make one size fits all claims. So yeah, that's kind of what we're doing here. Well, let's wrap this up. Ivor, thank you so much.
Not at all. Great stuff, Brian. Looking forward to seeing you end of July. Should be a blast.
All right, I'll see you then.
Bye now. Bye. Thanks.
Okay, thanks everyone for listening and sharing with a friend. Support us on Indiegogo. Just search for Food Lies. Support Ivor. You can find his book, Eat Rich, Live Long, on Amazon. Check out his website, thefatemperor.com, where you can see tons of free content to learn more about this. And we'll see you next time.